and we will start the webinar. All right, we'll give it a few minutes to give folks time to log in. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's live online event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Jessica, one of the co-owners of Greenlight, and we are so honored to be able to host tonight's informational forum, Should Parents Send Their Kids to Camp?, presented by the Prospect Lefferts Gardens Neighborhood Association and the Community Board 9 Education Committee, as well as the wonderful camp organizations you'll hear from tonight. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to our panel of experts for giving their time for this discussion tonight, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces right now, our community is still here, and we're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection together. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we begin. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see and hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. There are a couple different ways you can interact with the panelists and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation and interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question that you'd like to have answered by a panelist, please post that question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like 2 speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. We are recording tonight's event, so look for video or audio versions on our social media channels later on. Unlike most of our virtual events, there's no featured book to sell tonight, but if you'd like to support your neighborhood independent bookstore and allow us to continue to bring you books and programming for the neighborhood, you can shop in our store locations 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day, or shop online at greenlightbookstore.com, and we thank you for your support. So to introduce our panelists this evening, it's my honor and pleasure to turn things over to Brenda Edwards, the president of the Prospect Lefferts Neighborhood Association, one of our favorite neighbors. Take it away, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being a part of this very important discussion. So tonight, speaking in terms of the camp, should we send our children to camp, we have Riel from Trailblazers, and he's the director, and this is one of the oldest environmental educational programs of its kind. We have Crystal Bobb-Semple, who is the founder and CEO of Plato Learning. We have Dr. Percy Huggins, who is a pediatrician currently at Park Slope. We have Susie Lupert, who's the American Camp Associate, who is of the American Camp Association, and she is the director of the association in New York and in New Jersey. And I'm not sure if we have Luisa Bonafacio. If not, she will probably be coming along shortly. And she is the parent of a camper from 2020. So it's so great to have you all, and we are looking forward to hearing, your expert advice.
Thanks so much, Brenda. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for the panelists based on their areas of expertise, and we hope that you, as the attendees, will also have questions for them. So please do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A throughout the discussion, and then we'll move to those questions in the later half. So my first question is for the camp directors. So for Crystal and for Riel, who I think is still here. We lost his picture, but he's around. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, both Camp Halfblood and Trailblazers were open last summer. Can you talk about the difference between last summer and this summer, or what you learned from your experience running your camps last summer?
Crystal, would you like to start?
Okay, I'll hop in. Thank you everyone. Thanks for doing this forum. First of all, parents need information, and we really do need to be in community with one another, and that's what this gives us the opportunity to do. We did operate an abbreviated schedule. Camp Halfblood and Daring Girls are my 2 camp programs in Brooklyn, New York. And I mean, we learned that the kids are resilient. We were so worried about everything, and all they really needed was us to do what we do as adults and camp providers for years, which is to give them the space to be together with their friends, to heal from the difficulties that they often encounter during the school year, right? Camp is a respite, a place to kind of think about and reinvent yourself, a place to just get strength from folks who are deeply committed to your development and to your freedom, your personal freedom. And of course, we do that from a real point of privilege, right? Schools are difficult, family environments are difficult, neighborhoods are complicated. And at camp, we get to make a new community for our kids and to welcome them in. So many kids were scared. They were worried. They saw the tension from the adults. They knew what their parents and families were dealing with. They had spent weeks, in some cases, a couple of months, completely isolated from the normalcy of everyday life. And so they were apprehensive, but they came to us with just like open hearts and hopeful that the experience we could give them under the constraints of COVID would be enough. So it was different, but what I found, Jessica, is that it was enough. You know, they just needed to connect and have a sense that things would be normal once again. And that normalcy is, you know, what they sort of like hang their hats on, right? Things aren't the same, but we're going to be okay and we're going to survive. And I found that that's what kids taught myself and my staff last year, each other, I'm sure. And this year, what's going to be different is that the tensions are a little bit lower for some people, not for everyone, but our commitment to keeping each other safe has to stay the same. And so they're going to be dealing with a lot of the things that we're dealing with. This thing is not over, right? And we can feel better than we felt last year, but we still have to exercise precaution and care for others in our community, and to be very, very patient as people figure out where they fit in this, you know, ongoing pandemic. Folks' families' experiences are different, and so there's a lot of personal healing around health and safety that kids are actually dealing with. And I think that we were in the midst of something at the beginning, though we hoped we were at the end last year. And this year, we are actually going to be dealing with young people who know how the pandemic has affected their lives. Last year, they may have been afraid and concerned about it, but by and large, everyone knows, you know, what has happened, and we're going to have to help them heal. And that's what we're looking forward to doing for our campers this year, helping them try to heal from this, what's happened in the past year.
Thanks, Crystal. Riel, do you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, that's great, Crystal. Thank you. And I certainly echo all of that. I think that the thing that resonates most with me is this notion that the experience last year was very much a community experience, because there was so much unknown, and there was certainly the kind of concern and fear was certainly palpable, you know, within our own staff as well. And it became clear that the only way to do this is to make sure it was done with families and campers and staff and the organization really just doing it together. And that also meant that the experience became a really very cohesive experience as a result. What I think we then realized, which is I think what camps already knew, is that there are certain things that camps are uniquely equipped to do, to deliver. And even although schools over the years have started to, you know, adopt some of the thinking that camps have always promoted, and schools now understand that, you know, social emotional learning is an academic item that they should pay attention to. At the end of the day, there are certain things that schools can never do, simply by their organizational structure. They cannot, and camps can. And so in the midst of a pandemic, that only gets emphasized, how much more important that is, and how detrimental it is to our kids' health if they don't have the opportunity to experience camp. The main difference, I think, is that we know more. right? As Crystal mentioned, we were really in the middle of it with an enormous amount of information changing on an almost daily basis, not really, understanding what the next day would bring. And so we'd have to really kind of respond in real time. And now we know a lot more. We know that we can do this safely. We know what that looks like. We know what that requires from our staff. We understand more about how we can support our campers and our staff in that experience. And so we step into the experience completely different this year compared to last year. And I think the biggest takeaway for us is we know that we can do this in the safest possible way. I think a kind of a starting comment for all of this is that at the end of the day, camps can never, promise 100% safe environment, right? There's no such thing under the best of circumstances. And we continue to be very aware of the risk involved and the fact that this is in fact not over. I think we have, quite some distance to go. Having said all of that, we've learned, the camps that were open last year have learned what it looks like on the ground to do it as safely as possible and partner with parents to actually deliver that experience that gets them comfortable. Let me leave it there for now.
Thanks, Riel. Susie, I wonder if you could talk about that from a little macro perspective with the American Camps Association. How is this summer different from last summer? And what kind of guidance is ACA providing to camps, or what other kinds of guidance are camps receiving to do this the best way possible?
Yeah, just for the American Camp Association is the accrediting body in the United States for summer camps. So it kind of goes above and beyond. All camps are licensed by the Department of Health. So just so everybody understands that. And then some people also then choose to be accredited with the American Camp Association. We're the only accrediting body. So we provide a lot of professional development and a lot of field guides, and we work locally with each individual government at each state level to try to work on what these guidelines will look like. So in New York, for example, we literally have a meeting next week with the Department of Health with the guidelines that we wrote to say, this is how we think that camps can do this safely. And then we start doing feedback and trying to determine, what is the kind of optimal way that a camp can operate in the safest way possible. And, obviously we're going to, camp as we think about kind of traditional camp is going to look a little bit different, but our hope is that for children, it feels very much the same. I know that the camp directors on this call and every camp director just want children to have the best possible summer after the year that they've had. And so, from our perspective, certainly we're going to be seeing smaller group sizes, probably, than we have in years past. For overnight camps or camps where, a child is sleeping over, there's going to be some testing protocols that are going to have to come along with that as a child enters the camp. Screenings every day, as many non-pharmaceutical interventions as we can come up with to ensure that when a child arrives, they're not sick. And then being able to test on site for sleepaway camps, for example, if a child does come down with symptoms, being able to recognize symptoms. It's really, really important for parents to understand that, a camp that's licensed with the Department of Health, that's accredited with the American Camp Association, there's medical staff on hand that are trained to deal with this. The camp industry is 150 years old. This is not the first infectious disease that camps have dealt with. And what's incredible is they dealt with it really successfully last summer in the Northeast area. We've done a ton of research and there was hardly any cases to speak of. And that was in the midst of the pandemic. So we're at a totally different place now. And we do feel really confident going into the summer. And that being said, it's important for parents to speak to the camp that they're interested in their child going to, talk to the director, find out what the protocols are going to look like, make sure that it feels like the right fit for their family and for where their family's at. But there is a ton of different mitigations going in that camp directors are going to be required to do this summer to ensure that it's just a really safe environment.
Thanks, Susie. And just to circle all the way around, Percy, we were talking a little bit before the call about how much things have changed even in the past few months. So what has changed from your perspective in terms of the kind of medical information that's available and the kind of medical recommendations that you're making in terms of camps and what parents should be thinking about?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am very excited. I want these kids to have a really good summer. They absolutely deserve it. Compared to 2020 to 2021, a lot has changed. Vaccines, especially New York approving vaccines for 16 and above is huge. I don't know if all camps are going to require, I know they hire high schoolers and college kids, but I hope they greatly encourage all staff that can get the vaccine to get it. Testing has changed greatly. Back in this last summer, Tribeca Pediatrics, we have 30 plus locations. We only had about 5 places that were doing testing on kids. Now, all of our locations can test kids, symptoms, travel, screening, exposure. So it's much easier to kind of track symptoms, check kids before going to sleepaway, check kids even before potentially starting a new camp. So I think now screening has greatly changed, meaning if a kid has a sniffle, it's not a guessing game anymore. We can absolutely know whether this is COVID and whether these kids need to be quarantined or not. So I think the biggest thing that has changed is obviously the vaccines. It's 16 and above right now. There's, I don't want to make any promises, but there's a pretty good chance it'll probably be 12 and above by the time camp's really kicking off. And that would be a huge, huge difference. The other thing that we know is that, precautions and taking precautions work. Now that schools have opened up, New York, everyone was terrified of schools opening up. You look at the percentage of kids that are actually getting it from school, it's pretty low, less than 1%. And most of these are from kind of adults bringing it in. So if we can vaccinate these adults, these kids can definitely have a good summer at camp.
Thanks, Percy. And I think Luisa has joined us. Luisa, do you want to come on? Hi. So speaking as a parent who, as I understand, your kids actually went to sleepaway camp last summer, can you talk a little bit about what that was like as a parent, like what considerations you made? Did it work as expected? What was better? What was worse? And what you're anticipating this year? Don't forget to go off mute. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm trying to spare you guys the evening ruckus over here. I have a now 5-year-old. He was 4 last year when he joined Trailblazers summer camp here in Brooklyn, Prospect Park. And it was great. I mean, it worked out better than expected. Obviously, I think everybody was super nervous and anxious about the virus and what that would mean for kids. I think what was different in our consideration in having our son join was that I felt super safe and secure with what I think Trailblazer was communicating was the protocol. And also I think as a parent, having a kid be inside, a 4-year-old be inside for months and months, I was so ready for him to be outside and feeling kind of secure in that decision based on what the protocols were and sort of what the scientific data was saying, and just feeling kind of very safe. And like everybody was ready for for him to have that experience. So those are sort of like some of the considerations, and it worked out much better than expected. And yeah, really happy with the decision.
That's great. I feel like that's what we're all hoping to hear. So I'd love to hear. Let's maybe get a little more into the nitty gritty with the camp directors. Louise is talking about a day camp experience. So that's one aspect, and then there's also the overnight camp experience. So can you talk about different considerations for parents thinking about day camp versus overnight camp, and how those are working for you? Sorry, we can start with Crystal again.
So all of our camps are day camps, so I wouldn't be able to make the comparison. I'm sure Susie can. And let me just say that the ACA is an incredible resource. What an organization to have as sort of a trade and development space for camps. So thank you for all that you guys do. So we are completely outdoors. Once again, this year we operated the same way last year, and that was a big comfort for both parents and staff. Again, so much we didn't know, but what seemed to be consistent is that, being outdoors was the safer place to be. And so we will continue that practice. We've always been an outdoor camp program. What happened in years past is that we would have a rainy day location. And so when the weather was inclement, we would go indoors. Last year, those locations, which have typically been schools and churches, were unavailable to us. As we know, most buildings where there were going to be congregations of people were unavailable, to anyone really. And so that is changing, but it will be our policy this year, once again, to remain an all outdoor program and to go virtual when there is inclement weather. We did mandate masks for our staff and for kids, and both populations of people were extremely compliant. And so that is a practice that will continue for us. Social distancing was complicated. It's certainly something that we encouraged and we trained our staff to execute on. But it is very difficult to maintain, though we know that the kind of recommendations around it are different when you're in an outdoor space. And so, we, as Susie shared, we had no outbreaks of COVID at camp. And so that was great. But it's really hard to keep kids who are playing together outside 6 feet apart. And so we instituted a lot of ways that we could play games that just had some natural distance built into it. And it turned out to be a fun way to practice a very important precaution. We did institute a no sharing policy. And so we do lots of crafts at our camp programs. We call it forgery, right? Because they're, demigods and they're making weapons in the forge, and we just call it forgery because it works. And what we asked was for parents to bring more supplies from home than they typically had to do in the past. And that was really helpful. So as you might imagine, small packs of duct tape and pencils and markers and crayons, the things that we didn't want to have people share, because obviously we couldn't sanitize them with any level. Some things you couldn't sanitize at all, and then you couldn't sanitize it with a level of fidelity given the way kids share. We will do the same thing again this year. Ask parents to just pack a little craft pack along with their snacks and their lunch. Lunch has always been something that folks provided from home, and so that will be the same case for us in 2021. But last year we did ask that folks bring more water. Our water sources tended to be communal, right? We're operating in parks. We know what those fountains are like. And as a camp provider, we would do big coolers full of icy water, but that little nozzle that you have to press in those packs of cups are sources for contamination. And so we asked parents to bring a lot of water so kids could stay hydrated. Of course, we had emergency water for when that ran out or our kids didn't have enough, and we use that. So yeah, those are the things that are top of mind. And obviously hand washing and sanitation before and after meals, in between games, cleaning equipment and sanitizing equipment throughout the day and at the end of each day, as well as screening. Some of what Percy mentioned, well, all of what Percy mentioned, but obviously we've got some updates to the screening process based on the availability of vaccines that we have our fingers crossed will be open to younger and younger kids this summer. But certainly screening all of our staff and all of our campers, and asking families to be very vigilant about what they reported and how they paid attention to possible symptoms, so that we could act accordingly. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'll speak to the overnight portion for a moment. As far as day camp is concerned, Trailblazer Day Camp, but probably operationally, very similar to Camp Halfblood and the girls' day camp. Overnight camp is new because overnight camps in New York and New Jersey were not allowed to operate last year, even although the American Camp Association, and Susie can speak to this more, at the time also had already developed an extensive field guide for camps to follow. And so, camps in other parts of the country, I'm sure, found that very useful. We use a lot of that to guide our day camp programs as well. But now this year, camps in New York and New Jersey will be able to use that guidance to get their overnight camps up and running. I think the fact that so much has changed, especially in terms of diagnosis and testing and screening, we understand that so much better, paired with just the notion of outside transmission really being something very uncommon. I think is really the main reason that leaves us confident that we can operate a safe overnight camp. I think initially camps entertain the notion that you can create a sealed bubble in an overnight camp. That's not necessarily the approach we take. We take really guidance, and the more up-to-date guidance now, to make sure that we keep groups small, we screen up front, we screen throughout, and that is a better approach than to assume that you can somehow kind of seal off from the world at large. I think that idea, the cohorting, the podding, and keeping groups very small and consistent, limiting movement between the different groups, and certainly limiting switching of staff members between different groups. Those are things that kind of inherent to Trailblazers design already, but we had to kind of further lean into that and make sure that groups in the day camp, but same in overnight this summer, are really just going to be on their own, and will experience the camp on their own. Will be completely separated from other groups. But again, in an outdoor setting, paired with the right kinds of interventions, we feel that can be done safely, and so it will feel a little different for kids. There's certainly just the notion that you can get tested, that you'll get screened, etc. But one of the things that we're seeing already in some of the programs that we're running now, that many kids have now had to go through that. For all the challenges that New York City has experienced, I think by and large the city has done a remarkable job getting schools open. So there are large groups of kids who have experienced this, who have gotten used, including my own kids, to going into school, being masked, having to separate themselves, having to be tested when they could. And so a lot of those routines will show up in camp as well. And so we certainly expect kids to be a lot more easily adapted to that than we probably think they will be.
That's a good point. Thanks, Riel. And Crystal, I love all of the creativity around those games. I have a 9-year-old as well, so I know how that challenge with social distancing. So making that just part of the game is such a brilliant idea. I think we can go to questions from attendees in a minute, but Susie, I wondered if you wanted to speak to this question about sort of the different challenges of day camp versus overnight camp, and what kind of guidance you're providing, or what kinds of things parents should consider with those two options.
Yeah, I mean, the internal debate, especially before last summer, was which one's safer, is day camp or overnight camp? If you go to overnight camp, you can kind of get everybody in and close the gates, and maybe that's a better way to do it. Or day camp, it's this, and it's just incredible how far we've come, because we do believe that. We really do believe that there is a safe way to do both. To Riel's point, I think that for overnight camps in particular, certainly we're going to be seeing again, like, it's going to be all about contact tracing, right? So if we can get kids into these smaller groups, and then give them as much freedom as possible within those groups, right? Because we don't want them to be masked when they're in their cabins, when they're together, if they're eating with their group, like they're together 24 hours a day. So we want to give some semblance where they can really be themselves and be kids and have some freedom. So we are working with local departments of health to figure out, are there spaces within these small groups, if they're together for multiple days or multiple weeks, to be able to have, some freedoms within that. And I think that, for parents considering it, it's a big difference, right? Whether or not you're gonna, send your kid somewhere overnight, or whether you're gonna see them at the end of the day is an enormous decision to make for any family, especially if this is, a parent's first summer. What we can assure parents of, if they're concerned about, kind of the emotional toll that it might be for a child to go away for the first time, that's one thing. If they're concerned about the health and safety, we really can assure parents at this point that we really feel like we're coming up with ways that that we're not concerned about the child's health, and that we really do believe that the guidelines that we're creating are certainly not foolproof. Nothing is, but if we did it last summer in the midst of a pandemic, and by the way, sleepaway camps did not open in New York, but they opened in Maine, they opened in New Hampshire, they opened across the country, again, with almost 0 cases. So camps that were following really strict guidelines and ensuring lots of testing before the kids came, testing on site, daily screenings, medical professionals who know what they're doing and can look for signs, being outside 95% of the time, except when you're sleeping. It was, again, we saw barely any outbreaks. So there's a way to do it. But it is up to the parents to ensure that they're doing the research, that they're asking the questions, and that they feel confident that the program that they're sending their child to is really going to be following these guidelines in a way that will keep everybody safe.
Great. Before we go to audience questions, Luisa, I hate to interrupt because I feel like you're with a small person right now, but do you want to talk about what day camp was like specifically, like what some of the procedures and safety things were that you guys were working with?
Yeah, I know that there was a screening every morning before we dropped off. Everyone had to be masked, obviously. Temperature checks. We were asked screening questions if anyone felt sick, if we were near anybody that was sick. What else? The distance and play thing, I think, was talked about too. And Juno will come and say, oh yeah, when we're playing and running, we can have masks on. And when we're close, we have to have masks on. So it was like very easy for him to pick up on the nuances of like, when do we do this and when do we do that? What else? I'm trying to think. I think when one of the counselors, I think, was sick, something, and that was like very clearly communicated to us, which was really comforting and just good to know. Yeah, I think those are the things that I remember most about the routine of the day-to-day temperature checks. I think similar to what school parents are having to do anyway now.
Thank you. That'll make sense. All right. So we are starting to have some questions from attendees tonight. So I'll see if we can go in order. I think earlier someone was talking about mitigation, and Rachel is asking, are you able to share details on what those mitigation efforts might look like? Susie, was that something that you were talking about?
Yeah, that was probably me. So the specific guidelines that New York is putting together, which means like at the state level with the governor's office, with the state Department of Health, with the American Camp Association, is coming out any day now, but like we're hoping to see real actual guidelines in the next couple of weeks. Those will be public, and so any parent could potentially look at those, but they're going to be pretty specific about kind of the operations of how a camp works, and then camps in return will then be taking those guidelines, and then I'm assuming many of them will then be sharing certain parts of them with parents to make sure that they understand what the camper should expect upon arrival, during the course of the camp day, or if it's an overnight camp during the part of the session that they're going to be taking part in. So those guidelines are not officially out yet, so they are still a work in progress, but they will be out in the next couple of weeks.
Thanks. Just a reminder, if you have a question, to drop it into the Q&A. We're going to take questions from the Q&A first, and then if we have time, we'll look and see if there's some more in the chat that we missed. So this question is from Eliana. She says, my son will be going to day camp this summer and has been home since March of 2020. What advice do you have for parents who have children going to camp this summer after being in isolation for over a year? And Dr. Huggins, maybe that's something you want to answer. We were talking a little about the social emotional aspect earlier.
Yes, I'm very happy to chat about this. This has been a pretty rough year. I was telling the panelists prior to this, even as young as 7, 8, we're seeing signs of depression, not wanting to do anything. So I think having these kids have something to look forward to. So if your son's been home since last March, even just the mention of camp can be a little anxiety provoking, but kind of really boost it up, reassure him, that this is going to be safe, practice practice wearing the mask, which if you're a New Yorker, you probably already are, in terms of like when you're walking around the block, most kids that are in school now, or even the hybrid method, are so used to mask wearing that they don't even pay attention to it anymore. It's almost when I go to examine them, and ask to open their, mouths in the office, they almost panic as if I'm taking their mask off, which is kind of sad, but I mean, we've just hammered it into them. So it is a blessing in the fact that even in summer, even in these hot things, these kids can wear masks and they're okay. So I would say for your son, just stress, the important things, pack your hand sanitizer, teach him when to use it, multiple masks, teach him when to change it, and reassure him that you're sending him because you want him to have fun and that you believe that this is going to be safe. So that some kids that are kind of re-entering, as New York has just had kids sign back up. So I have a lot of kids re-entering school for the first time and seeing some new onset anxieties related to that. So my biggest thing would be that you're stressing that, you're doing this because you believe it's safe, and then just reiterate, normal precautions that your child could take to help them through it.
Does anyone else want to speak to that transition from a long isolation to camp?
I mean, we believe, that camp can really be the antidote to a lot of the, issues that children have been having this past year: isolation, depression. We're seeing a rise in obesity. We're seeing, rise in as Dr. Huggins pointed out, in mental health issues as young as 7, 8 years old. Camp really can be this safe place for kids to, in a really structured way, have a lot of fun, be kids again, be outside, connect with other people. And it is, we believe, obviously, it's certainly time for children to start doing this again, but that really, we have seen camp change children's lives for over 100 years. And during, something like this, it's kind of a prime moment if a family is considering it, like, this is the summer, like this really could be, the moment that, to see your child kind of get out of whatever funk that they're in and try some new experiences in a safe way.
I had a couple of parents, literally just to just say to me that it wasn't working, right? Their kids felt too anxious about being at camp. They were excited. They thought it was going to be okay. And it just was creating a level of anxiety that they didn't anticipate. And I was happy to have that conversation, just to work on an outcome with a parent that, we thought was fair. And so I just marked that to say, I think one of the things parents should be asking of camp providers is, what are you going to do? What happens when it's just not working? And I think it's fair. We of course have had a really tough year financially, and it was very, very difficult to honor, to give credits or to do refunds. But there are just some moments where parents need some compassion. And I think that working with camp directors who have kind of thought about that and are open to solutions when it just doesn't work is a big part of what parents should be asking now, and as opposed to just when they are faced with a situation like that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and Crystal, you made this point at the beginning of the call, right? That this moment of beginning to heal is a community project. It is something that has to be done together. And so, one of the things that I would recommend to parents is to really engage the camp, because it is something that you need to do together, right? That it's not just signing them up and then bringing them on day one, especially if you have concerns about your child being able to kind of adapt into a camp situation. That this is the time more than ever to really partner with your camp and get to know the staff, get to know the directors, get to know the staff, and spend some time with them at the beginning or the end of the day to the extent that is possible. So it can be customized. And the reality is that camps will have some restrictions that make them less flexible, right? Trailblazers used to have quite significant flexibility around signups that we cannot do anymore. So right now it's just 5 days. We used to have some flexibility to switch kids groups, right? We won't be able to do that anymore as easily, right? So those are real restrictions. And to avoid that, I think that the best you can do as a parent is to really engage with the camp, to really let them know how you are feeling, what you think some of your kids' concern might be, and so you can partner with it. This is very much a moment of community.
Thank you all. That's super helpful. Here's a question from Devin, who asks, if the day camp is indoors, what are some mitigation efforts the camp should be doing? And I'll let anyone take that who wants to either talk about what you have done or what you would recommend.
I mean, I think that the day camps that are going to be taking place indoors are going to look very similar to schools, honestly. There's going to be more social distancing for sure between kids as opposed to cohorts. I would imagine that they're still going to try to find some ways to eat outdoors or do other things outdoors. But certainly there's plenty of camps that operate out of schools and operate out of churches and operate out of many different buildings, especially in New York City. But what we're going to be seeing in terms of guidelines is going to be probably very similar to what a child is already experiencing in school. My hope, though, is that they're still finding ways to get the children outside as much as possible during the course of the day.
All right, that works. Here's a question from Para. Hi, Para. She is asking specifically of Dr. Huggins, could you clarify the science regarding outdoor social distancing? Is it necessary if masked? And also around sharing materials, is it still scientifically necessary to not share materials?
Hi, Barrett. Yes. As you know, in this last year, it's really hard to have any direct science because things change. It depends on when things are studied. If things are studied in summer, like last year, where the numbers are low, compared to things are studied in January 2021, it can kind of greatly sway what we think could be a contributor to COVID or not. So I would say, in terms of the science of outdoor social distancing, we know that any sort of ventilation prevents your risk of COVID. So it greatly reduces your risk of COVID. So all of these camps, like I mentioned, or they mentioned, are primarily outdoors. So in terms of safety camps for school, camps are probably almost even more safe than a lot of these city schools that can barely open windows. The science, again, it's hard when you see kids play. New York summer is at 90 degrees. You see them with their masks and they're sweaty, they're ripping them off. Even walking to the grocery store, the bodega with the mask on in the summer was really, really rough. So there's probably a decent amount that in the height summer, these kids will be pulling their masks off if they're playing kickball or social distancing games and things like that. We know masks work. We're still going to encourage all these kids to wear them as much as physically possible. So outdoor is safer. We're going to keep a mask. Now, in terms of sharing materials, what Crystal mentioned, I don't remember when we stopped bleaching our groceries, but there was a point, where we were Cloroxing our groceries. We did not know. I mean, playgrounds were blocked off because they didn't know if you could get it from a swing set or a slide. We've come a long way. Kids could probably honestly share duct tape in the older kids. Your younger ones, your 5-year-olds that might rub their snot and touch things, probably better to have distancing things if possible. But I think, Crystal was just saying that these camps are doing everything they possibly can to limit, interaction, kids touching things that other kids would touch. They probably could touch things. They're going to touch, the same ball, the same kickball. You're not going to go bleaching the dodgeball in between someone using it. But I think for the younger kids that still, don't know how to cover their mouths when coughing, things like that, probably better to have some, personal items. Hopefully that answers all your questions.
Thanks, that's super helpful. Here's a question from Grace, and specifically for Riel. Grace is asking, will Trailblazers day campers be wearing masks outside?
Yes, they will. I think, especially, because we have moved into a world where mask wearing has become the norm, and the vast majority of kids have to wear it in school. I think there are probably some exceptions and maybe some independent schools, but by and large, kids are just used to it, and our staff is as well. And so we will continue that from last year as well. So kids and staff will be required in the day camp to wear masks 100% of the time, except when they're eating, of course. Yes, masks will be required.
All right, here's another question. It's kind of about trailblazers, but it might be better for Susie or Percy to answer. Deborah says, my son will be going to Trailblazer camp and sleeping with 3 other kids and their counselor in a sort of a tent. Is that considered safe or enough safe?
You can start, Susie.
Yeah. Yes. Look, there are certain things that the kids are going to be doing. It's going to be, they're going to be sleeping, head to feet, as an example, so even when they're asleep, they will actually be over 6 feet apart, as, physically from one another. They're not going to be wearing masks while they sleep. But tents are actually really great. They're open air, there's a lot of ventilation. I'm not saying that cabins aren't safe, but I'm just saying that, actually in that particular situation, we do believe that there is a safe way to do that. And again, they're going to be with this small group at Trailblazers, for example. That's their cohort, that's their group. If someone does get sick, it's not as though the entire camp has been infected, or that 500 kids are suddenly have to be sent home. Because we're doing these small cohorts, we really can contact trace very quickly. Yes, we do believe that there is a safe way for kids to sleep together in tents or cabins.
And it should be said that sleeping in a Trailblazers hogan under canvas is as close to sleeping outside without actually being really outside. You're still on the cover, but it's essentially fully open air, so it's 100% circulation.
Yeah.
All right, I think we have time. We can sort of dig through the chat. I think there are a couple more questions that I might have missed. Here's a very specific one. For children in foster care, will camps accept testing results from our agency medical department?
Absolutely. And we're working with states to ensure that if a child, like if for example, the guideline comes down and says a child needs to come with a negative test within 72 hours, it has to be PCR, et cetera. We're also working with states to ensure that if a child doesn't come with those things, what can the camp do to ensure that the child can still attend camp? Can there be testing on site? Can the medical director at the camp give that test? What would that look like? Because it is of the utmost importance to us that we can get any kid that wants to go to camp at camp. And so absolutely, I can't imagine a situation in which wherever that test is coming from would not be considered valid. And we are working with states so that if a child cannot come with that test for whatever reason, that there is a way for that child to still attend.
I'd also like to just quickly mention, testing also has come a long way. So again, last spring, we were almost even encouraging parents not to get it because, it was still taking 5 to 7 days for the results to come back. And then it was like, what good was that? So now we're down to about 24, 72 hours in terms of testing. So in terms of screening right before a kid goes to camp, it is feasible. And also New York City has done great, completely free testing sites. So if they're a camper coming from New York City going somewhere else, they should be able to find a test for free pretty easily. But it wouldn't matter. I would say the only thing that in terms of whether it came from an agency or not that a camp might care about is timing. But even the agency testings are coming back pretty quickly these days.
Thank you both. Brenda, our PLGNA president, is asking, any suggestions for children attending camp in other states, such as North Carolina? I'm going to actually post the link here to the American Camp Association in case anyone wants to. I believe there's some resources there, but if anyone has other suggestions, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, every state is really different. I'm going to be honest. We just saw the guidelines from Georgia, and they were basically like, go to camp, have fun. And so I'm good. As we all know, this country, seems to think that our borders are actual walls in between us, as opposed to just being able to drive over. So it really varies very, very greatly. I mean, in New York, it's considered a very, I don't want to say over-regulated, but a very regulated state, as any camp director can attest to. And so it's just going to be much more strict. And the whole Northeast is going to be much more strict than it is in the southern part of the country, or the middle part of the country as well. And there's lots of reasons about that, obviously. But in North Carolina in particular, there's a huge amount of camps down there. It's an enormous part of the camp industry. And many of them ran very successfully last summer. So we do expect them to be running. And we actually, in North Carolina in particular, we do expect that there's going to be fairly strict guidelines, I guess I would say. But the ACA site that Jessica just posted, there's a section there that people can go to if they're interested, where it actually lists each state, whether or not their guidance have come out, what the guidelines are, links to the CDC, et cetera. And so it is a pretty comprehensive place if parents or families want to check that out.
I'll ask a question as a parent because I can, of the camp directors. I'd love to hear a little bit about how your camp capacity has changed from last year to this year. Because I feel like for some of us, we're like, oh, it's getting a little late. Summer's coming up really quick. Do you expect to have enough to meet the demand? And how has that shifted between last year and this year?
The pods help us to keep capacity very similar from year to year. And so we are seeing where the demand is this year and how it might be different, from years past. But because we're sticking to the pod size, we technically are just adding another pod or subtracting a pod to react to our enrollment size. A lot of families have left the city. A lot more families are not taking vacations or spending the entire, kind of summers away. And so we don't know how that's going to net out in the end. Last year, our capacity at one of our camps was exactly the same as it had been in all other years, surprisingly. And a lot of that happened at the last minute. And one of our other programs, the enrollment was very low. So we were severely under capacity in those programs. I think we will look a lot more like we usually do. This year, there's still time. I would tell parents that they are not alone. I think a lot of folks have been waiting for a lot of the things that we're hearing now and the guidelines that we'll hear over the next couple of weeks before making their decisions. And I think that makes sense because folks have to feel comfortable, really comfortable with the decisions that they're making. And that comes down to information. And the information is always changing and it's not always coming out as fast as we need it to be. And so I say there's time for folks to still make a decision around camp.
Yeah, I think Crystal and I are fortunate in the sense that we run the kinds of programs that we are able to position ourselves as a particularly safe alternative. I think because we are virtually 100% outside. For Trailblazers, that has meant that we've taken the opportunity to actually expand. We added a site in Brooklyn Bridge Park. We're hopeful to announce in short order expansion into Upper West Side, and so plenty of capacity for us. Also because the pod size always had been a thing, but we did reduce the overall the number of kids in the pod, but we increased the number of pods. And so on the overnight side, the pod size always had been around 8. And so the capacity for the moment, and based on the guidance that we expect, the overnight size should be the same for us. And we feel very fortunate that our model is really just well suited for this particular scenario.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. Here's a question from Rebecca, who's another person I know. She happens to be the other co-owner of Greenlight Bookstore, and I know a big Trailblazers fan. Her she said she was really impressed last year with Trailblazers' ability to spread out the pickup and drop-off locations. Is that going to be happening again? And then she also was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you keep the bubbles or the pods stable with minimal changes when kids are rolling in and out over different weekly sessions. So that's kind of a day camp question. Maybe you can speak to that, Riel and Crystal as well.
You can go ahead, Crystal.
So what we found with enrollment so far this year is that parents are signing up together. A lot of families have already been operating with pods. They probably thought it was a good idea last year, but now they understand how it has helped, them kind of manage this moment for their family. They've learned that kids needed stability, in really particular ways this year. And so many of our families approach us with their groups already intact. And we've been able to honor that. And so to the question of, keeping the bubbles kind of consistent, we've been able to do that. And our parents have reliably registered with that in mind. And so, to Riel's point about partnership, we've been on the same page with that this year, and that's been great. And then Riel, I think the other question was about drop off and pickup.
Yeah, so structurally very similar. No large gatherings. That was clear that couldn't happen last year, and so that's one of those things where you're forced to make a change that actually end up being a operationally very functional and positive change. And so we expect to do something very similar this year, just with a much larger number of groups. The consistency is difficult, and it means, but it sometimes simply means that a group can't fill because or sometimes it means that a child can get the week that they want, because we do require that parents stick to the same group. So if you are a Pathfinder in week 2, you have to return to Pathfinder, and so that limits some of the movement. And then the big challenge for us is of course to make sure that the staffing stays consistent on those groups as well. Again, that was always a goal for Trailblazers, simply from a kind of social, emotional, and developmental perspective, that we love to be able to send kids back to their same staff members, even if they miss 2 weeks of camp. So you come in week 2, you come again in week 5, you return to your counselor, and you've already formed a bond, and so you can continue to deepen that bond. But now that's a podding concern, is to make sure that does in fact happen. So between small groups, having to sign up for the same group, whether you do 1 week or 6 weeks, it has to be that group. And then similar to what Crystal says, lots of families, because they can select their own groups, they'll select the groups together at the same time and they enroll together. So they've podded already.
Thank you. So we are just about out of time. So I have one last question I'm hoping each of you can answer. For parents who are still deciding or who want to explore camp options, what would you recommend as resources for them? Either places to find specific camp information or the kind of health and safety information that they will need to make these decisions. So if you could give us 1 or 2 recommendations for places that parents should go for that are great resources, I'd love to hear that from each of you.
Our association is a nonprofit organization. We're designed to offer the public guidance. People can actually call us at the American Camp Association anytime, and we have experts on our staff who talk specifically to parents about camp, about choosing a camp, about which camps might make sense for your child. So that's certainly a resource. It's free, and it's just the way that we interact with the public and ensure that we're spreading the good word about summer camp.
We follow the guideline as it comes from the ACA, and of course we take local guidelines into consideration as well. But it is a wonderful place to start the search for information. So I would just double down on what Susie said.
And I also recommend parents is join your local groups, at the Facebook groups of the schools, et cetera. There's lots of conversation there between parents, and look, at the end of the day, you have to find the right fit. There's lots of kind of things to consider around the safety of a particular camp, but the first thing you should figure out is whether this is the right camp for your child, right? Because the safest camp might still not be the right camp for your child, and so you really have to figure out what experience would best suit your child given the circumstances. And then the local groups, there's lots of wonderful conversation and exchange about what the different groups are doing or different camps are doing in your neighborhood.
I'll just add too, I mean, most kids are due for their annual school checkup coming up soon, usually spring into summer. So touching base with your pediatrician, we screen, like I said, for things like anxiety, depression, social anxiety during our interviews now more than ever. So that's a good starting point too, just to see, how will my kid do? Do I need to kind of talk to him a little bit about getting back into the world? I agree with Riel in terms of talking to your neighbors. If your neighbor went to Camp Halfblood, that might be the best recommendation, in terms of how was it? How did you feel about it? Will you do it again? Is a huge resource. But I recommend everyone kind of come and get your checkup. Just to kind of review and see, what interests your kid has, and kind of helping to pursue that, less so what you're into or what you hope your kid will be into, and kind of really try to feel, they all found their little quirks being home this summer. So trying to kind of find what they're going to be happiest at. I agree. It sounds like most camps are doing their best to keep it as safe as possible. So, talking to the director of the camp, and then really talking to your kid about what would get them most excited. I cannot stress enough, these kids really need something to look forward to. And I think camp is going to be it.
Luisa, any resources that have been helpful for you as a parent to make decisions about camp or find out more? Oh, I think Luisa might be frozen. Sorry. Well, thanks so much to all of our panelists for all of this information and insight. We appreciate all of you so much. We're definitely going to be sending folks to the ACA website to find out more. You can also find out more on the Trailblazers website and the Plato Learning website, which will direct you to Camp Halfblood and the Double Daring Camp for Girls. We'll have this recording on YouTube within the next couple of days, so you can share with other folks who are trying to get information as well. Thank you guys all so much for your time, and have a great summer.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much,
all.
everybody. Have a great
Take
evening.
care.
Take care.